Welcome to Tomorrow.Africa, the podcast that explores the possibilities and the potential of Web3 in the African continent. We believe that the future of Africa is bright and that emerging technologies such as blockchain can accelerate its development. We interview people who contribute to this breakthrough in Africa and around the world and who hold a positive vision for the future. My name is Yassi Lokman and I'll be your host for this podcast. In today's episode, I'll be interviewing John OConnor, the director of the African operations at IOHK, the company behind the Cardano blockchain. We'll be discussing the characteristics of Cardano and the advantages of the proof-of-stake consensus mechanism it chooses. We'll also be discussing what third-generation blockchains like Cardano are, how they can serve as the infrastructure upon which more robust, reliable, and inclusive digital systems can be built, and why decentralized technologies are particularly interesting in the context of African countries. John will be sharing some of the achievements of IOHK in Africa, the key partnerships they were able to establish so far, and how they plan to grow across the continent in the future. We'll also be talking about the opportunities that the Cardano ecosystem offers for African entrepreneurs and how you can leverage it to build your solutions. John, welcome to the show.
Pleasure. Very, very pleased to be here. Thank you for having me.
John, thank you for accepting the invitation. I'm very excited about this episode. There is much I would like to discuss with you. You're currently the African operations director at IOHK, the company behind the Cardano blockchain. Cardano is one of the most exciting and promising blockchain projects. It has so far lived up to the expectations, and there is much happening in the Cardano ecosystem, including in Africa. But before diving deeper into Cardano, its ecosystem, and what you guys are doing in the African countries, I'm curious to know more about you. John, first, where are you based? What got you to your current position at IOHK as the Africa Operations Director? And what is your relationship to the African continent?
Yeah, I've been working for Cardano in one role or another for about 5 years. So I graduated from Oxford with a degree in politics, philosophy, and economics, and knew immediately that I wanted to work in the technology space. So I spent 4 or 5 years in London working in the tech startup scene when I was approached by a couple of people who just started working for the Cardano Foundation, or really setting it up. So at the time, I think there was probably 10 to 15 people working on the Cardano project. Charles had literally just incorporated IOHK. And I knew very, very little about Cardano and Charles. I'd been reading about blockchain and I knew a little bit about Ethereum, but I wasn't really aware of his role as the first CEO. So just to do my own parts of a basic due diligence, I started Googling and I saw this video of Charles talking at TEDx in Bermuda. And it just really spoke to me. The purpose of the talk was really about how this technology has so much promise for financial inclusion. I'd always been very interested in emerging economies. By background, I'm half Irish, half Ethiopian, and had always basically been interested in that part of my heritage and connecting that up with some of the economics which I'd been learning. So for me, blockchain seemed to be a really amazing confluence of my interest in technology, in developing markets, and the opportunity to work on a team that was focused around this mission. And this vision really, really spoke to me. So I basically took the job immediately. My first role was head of strategy at the Cardano Foundation. And after a couple of years of helping us close our raise, getting our exchange agreements done, getting listing, liquidity, and of course building up our community portals, setting up our Reddit, PR. I basically decided I wanted to work more on the adoption part of crypto rather than the sort of more foundation-y stuff. So I pitched Charles one day. I said, "Hey, why don't we set up an Africa operations side?" And gave Charles maybe like a 5 or 6 page deck. And he was like, "Brilliant. Why don't you fly next week?" So I started thinking about, where would make sense and how we'd approach this. And yeah, a couple of weeks later, I moved to Ethiopia to start trying to figure out where we could deliver an impact, where our technology would really fit the needs of the countries that we were professing to want to serve. And that was the beginning of my Africa story at IOHK and at Cardano.
So Cardano is today one of the major blockchain projects, not only in terms of the market cap of its cryptocurrency ADA, but also considering its potential and all it is already happening within its ecosystem. As you've said, it was founded by Charles Hoskinson, the co-founder of Ethereum, and it has since followed a rigorous and scientific approach for its developments. John, how do you explain Cardano to someone that barely knows what blockchain is? And how do you explain its difference with other famous blockchains like Ethereum and Bitcoin?
So to answer that question, I think you first need to start by explaining blockchain and cryptocurrencies. So typically, if I'm trying to give a very simple explanation, I start by saying that really all a blockchain network is created to do is to figure out how we can solve the banking ledger problem. So who owns what or who holds what in their account? Typically, obviously, banks do this by keeping a centralized record on who's got what in their account. Blockchain enables us to distribute this record keeping amongst a number of people who have software on their device which keeps track of who owns what. In order to decide who's right, who's wrong, we have what we call a consensus method or a consensus protocol, which says if over 50% of the people in this network agree that this is who owns what, then this is, who owns what. So it's an innovative way of using technology to solve this ledger problem. And the cryptocurrency is just the form of value, like the US dollar that we use to keep track. It's the unit of account. So this is the basic concept of blockchain and of cryptocurrencies. What separates the various different cryptocurrencies is how they go about this problem. They have different methodologies of keeping track, different ways of incentivizing people to be a part of this network. Rather than getting too technical about it, I'd say that the Cardano blockchain was really designed with a couple of key paradigms in mind. One was scientific rigor. Obviously, if you're shifting away from having a central bank or a single bank to keep all of this account and shifting more towards technology and code, you really want to be very confident that this is going to behave the way you think it will. If people are going to be holding real value, well, then we need to make sure we protect that value by having these assurances that the code will execute correctly and that people aren't going to lose value. So Cardano really started with this academic rigorous approach. We have research partnerships with, I think, 10 to 15 universities across the world. We have labs at the University of Edinburgh, Tokyo Tech University, a number of ones across Europe and the US. So this approach is one of the fundamental differences between how we approach things and how technology in general is often built, which is this move fast and break things ideology. So that's a big one for us, this sort of research-driven approach. The second thing which we've done is designed a system where it's very cheap to transact on the system. Blockchains have costs associated with moving money, with sending money from A to B. Cardano has been created to try to minimize that cost to something very affordable. So you could imagine you could send $1 million worth of value at around sort of 30 to 50 cents at current prices. So that represents a very cheap and efficient way to be able to move value. So this is another sort of USP when it comes towards our blockchain protocol. If you add all of this together, what we have is a very secure system that enables people to build financial applications that are rigorous, that have a lot of security proofs, and are highly scalable. So that's really the ethos of Cardano.
The Cardano is, I think, also considered as third generation blockchain. First generation blockchain being the ones allowing transactions to happen, like Bitcoin, without a need for third party. Second generation blockchains are blockchains upon which smart contracts can be executed without a need for a third party. Smart contracts being simple lines of code. And third generation blockchains are blockchains that could technically serve as the infrastructure upon which sophisticated software can be executed in a decentralized way, right?
Very well put. Maybe you should do my job.
And it is also using the proof of stake consensus mechanism, which means, as you said, that it is scalable and can execute these programs in an energy efficient way. While there are still a lot of blockchains that use other consensus mechanisms that are not scalable.
Yeah, maybe we should just dive in a little bit on that point. So one of the things I get asked a lot about is energy consumption. People see that Bitcoin is consuming more energy than countries like Belgium, and and particularly in the modern world, that causes a lot of concern. And as you say, this is based on the fact that we're using these proof of work methodologies. To simplify it, it means that a complex mathematical problem is being solved every time we perform this ledger writing. But it's not required. This is ultimately a design decision done from way back when Bitcoin was originally being created. And there are much simpler, or maybe not simpler, but more energy efficient ways of accomplishing the same goal. And this is what proof of stake systems do, and it's what Cardano is based on. This means that we can run this global financial network for the similar amount of power as what it would take to run a small town rather than countries. So ultimately, proof of stake offers this possibility of very cheap and energy efficient transactions. That's what Cardano was built on.
It seems like Cardano has been particularly focused on the African continent compared to other areas. Many other blockchain projects claim that their technology can be revolutionary in the developing world without necessarily having teams working and developing solutions directly in these countries. You guys at Cardano have been particularly active in Africa through partnerships, the organization of events, and the development of solutions on field tailored for needs specific to Africa. What reasons had led Cardano to specifically focus on Africa, and what role is the Cardano platform and ecosystem aiming to play in the African continent?
Right. So if you're to look at the modern history of Africa in terms of a technology perspective, there have been some amazing leaps done recently. You'll often hear this phrase of leapfrogging technology, and often that's referring to the fact that in Africa, internet's provided by mobile carriers. We skipped over the broadband ADSL line period. And this is a concept which can be quite powerful if governments and companies realize that there are possibilities to implement the latest and greatest technology rather than going through the same adoption curve that we maybe saw in the West. So from the perspective of a company like ours, this is very interesting. We see huge needs for provision of finance for SMEs, huge needs for the creation of digital identities for people to be able to prove who they are and authenticate into various services. And these needs are not just in Africa. We see them in the West as well. The difference about, maybe let's say the UK and Ethiopia is that in the UK, we have a lot of these systems already. Sure, they may be expensive, they're legacy in some function, but they do provide a good job. An example which we sometimes use is the land registry. The UK has a fantastic land registry. Very rarely will you end up with disputes over who owns what piece of land. But this land registry has, I think, 9,000 people working in it. It's a heavily manual and traditional process. So when we look at countries which have large land registry disputes, which is very common in the region, in sub-Saharan Africa, well, you could see the possibility of going and implementing a new blockchain-based system and have a reasonable expectation that adoption might be easier for this technology within these markets than it would in a country like the UK, where you have such an established system. So this makes it very interesting from a technologist perspective. We're building technology that we feel creates large amounts of value or has that potential. So making sure you find markets where you believe that adoption case is there is very important. So that's, I think, why there's a lot of interest. The second thing is that, of course, there are large amounts of liquidity now being stored on these blockchain projects, value that's looking for yield. Ultimately, if we're trying to rebuild some form of financial system with cryptocurrencies and blockchain, well, then you're going to need people who are going to borrow and people who are going to lend. You have very fast growing economies within the continent where businesses have struggled to find access to capital, even with very strong business models and very low chances of default. So this is also an interesting concept now. We have the liquidity stored within cryptocurrencies. We have highly dynamic, fast-growing emerging economies which are looking to borrow off that liquidity to be able to create growth. So just from a banking perspective and a provision of capital perspective, these markets are also very interesting.
So Cardano can be used as the infrastructure upon which systems can be built, right?
Absolutely. And these sort of basic infrastructures that you're talking about, well, identity, which is why we focus hard on digital identity projects, lending and borrowing, these basic financial primitives, which can now be built with smart contracts. You start adding all of this together, this underlying financial infrastructure, and you can start enabling a lot of the economic growth, which I think everyone is quite keen to see achieved. So that's it, building the underlying infrastructure and hoping to see an ecosystem of products built on top of that.
That's true. When you think about it, developed countries are developed because their systems are developed. Their voting systems, their traffic systems, their distribution systems. I mean, all types of systems. The problem is that in most African countries, these systems are deficient, sometimes corrupt, or sometimes simply inexistent. And these systems are interdependent. So if one is deficient, that would often mean that the others would also struggle to work properly. For example, if you don't have an identity document for some reason, then you cannot open a bank account. So then you cannot also travel. You cannot ask for a loan, for insurance, and so on. So I would say that Africa does not suffer a brain drain because the populations think that the grass is greener elsewhere, but because the systems are better in the countries they go to. And that's what's so exciting about blockchains like Cardano, that they can serve as the infrastructure upon which all types of systems can be built. They're open and permissionless, so anyone could access it. They're decentralized, so they're not at the mercy of a single authority. They're collaborative, and they do not have a single point of failure. What's also exciting is that not only this technology can be used to develop systems within African countries, but it can also serve as a way to bridge developing countries to the developed world in a market where anyone can transact and contribute regardless of their location and nationality. So that's very exciting.
Absolutely. And once again, very, very well put.
John, could you tell more about your activities of IOHK in Africa and what you have accomplished so far?
Absolutely. So, riffing off what you just said, when I moved to Ethiopia and started to build up the team there, we were looking at interesting opportunities which we could provide technology for. The initial areas I was interested in were things like remittance, financial flows, and seeing whether we could make them better, faster, cheaper. What quickly became evident, though, was that we needed some form of digital identity or digital identity framework, which we could ground this concept of who you are to, because no one's going to lend or send money to someone without some concept of who's on the other side of this transaction. So we started looking at how we could start building this digital identity concept in a decentralized and secure fashion. So there's a movement going on, which is the self-sovereign identity movement, of how we can change the ownership of one's data from some third party who holds it about you towards the individual themselves. This could be the equivalent of with a passport. If I have my physical passport on me, well, that's actually proof of who I am. Sure, it's been validated and issued by the state, but I can hold that information. Typically, as we moved into the digital world, actually, that's not the case. I log on to Facebook, and Facebook is the one who's controlling and holding my data about me. So we tried to sort of create the approximation of this physical passport back into the digital world, where I own and control my data and can authenticate into a variety of services with that. Well, our first project to use this was with the Ministry of Education in Ethiopia. This is a project we're rolling out now, where we're doing the issuance of educational credentials, how you performed in your exams, how you performed in your degree, and shifting that onto the self-sovereign model. So with this system, students have the benefit that if in the future their schools or their universities aren't responsive, don't want to give them their degree or grade transcripts in the future, then the user themselves still has control of this identity information and can share it with an employer to prove they've done this work and to prove they've got a job. So this sort of administrative bureaucracy example is one of many which you'll find. Obviously, with the civil war in Ethiopia, lots of schools in the north of the country in Tigray have been destroyed. And those students have lost their educational passports or their educational information. So you can see how a system like this would be resilient against some of the challenges that you see. The last example of a challenge which you find commonly is actually fake degrees and fake transcripts. This is a huge issue with people creating fraudulent degrees to be able to get work or get jobs. So a system like this is also resilient against that sort of forgery. So it's a useful first step, and we're actually rolling out right now into the first test schools across the country. But this identity framework is obviously much bigger than just educational degrees. We hope to now start using this within financial use cases. So businesses can have the information about their cash flows or whatever stored in some form within this identity so that they can then share that information with a prospective lender in order to be able to receive finance. So these are just two examples, but as you can see, identity is sort of foundational to many, many different applications, including voting and governance. So yeah, we've worked hard on this identity project, and now we're trying to take it from this educational example towards these financial application examples, so it can be used as the basis of creating trust and credibility over a lending use case.
Are there some other countries in Africa or areas in Africa where you're aiming to grow in the upcoming years?
Absolutely. So, as I say, we started in Ethiopia, and that's a project which we're growing. We'd look to expand it maybe into other forms of identity within the country. I've actually recently moved to Kenya into Nairobi to really start working on this SME working capital lending use case. So after we've got that first project rolling in Kenya, then we'd look to expand it to both Ghana and Nigeria. So rather than thinking about things in terms of let's add countries, what we really want to focus on now is building products that can scale across geographies. And I think that the most major of those for us will probably be this lending use case, which we're calling Real Finance or RealFi, which is really predicated on connecting up cryptocurrency liquidity to these real world asset classes. And for us, that's the perfect product for the African continent. Large amounts of demand and sorely needed.
Other than this digital identity use case, do you see some specific areas where you believe blockchain can lead to a noticeable breakthrough in Africa in the short term?
Yeah, so then let's talk more about RealFi. So if you to look at Africa, 80% of jobs are actually created from small and medium-sized enterprises. We have much smaller amounts of state-owned enterprise driving job creation. It's really a continent of small-scale businessmen and businesswomen. But still, the vast majority of these companies and businesses find it almost impossible to access finance for some of the reasons that we've already given. You can imagine you're a small-scale news agent that's been operating for 30 years, and you want to borrow a small amount of money for maybe more inventory for the holiday season. Even with this great trading history, you may lack the formal methods of accounting, nice QuickBooks or some other accounting software to be able to go and share with a local bank to be able to generate confidence on the basis for the basis of a loan. So this basic asymmetry of information, identity program, a lack of liquidity or capital available in these local markets for lending all constitute a massive blocker towards your growth. And the story of this single SME is, of course, the story of the continent. So this is an area that we think is going to be hugely, hugely interesting in the future, enabling these cornerstones of identity that we've talked about, plus liquidity available on cryptocurrencies and on the blockchain, to funnel into providing loans for these 80% of the SMEs who are all looking for financing. So this is it. How do we solve this missing credit market with some of these primitives of identity and capital available? This, for us, I think, could be the key area that Cardano looks to build on in the next few years. Really, just trying to provide finance to those who don't have it.
You've mentioned the term RealFi. That's not a term I'm familiar with. We often hear about DeFi, decentralized finance. So what is RealFi and what is its difference with DeFi?
Absolutely. I probably should have started by defining it. So RealFi is a word that I coined maybe a couple of years ago in opposition almost to decentralized finance or DeFi lending. If you were to look at DeFi lending, typically these loans are fully collateralized. I have a pool of cryptocurrency value sat within a wallet. I can now borrow US dollars against the value in there. And this is locked up within some form of smart contract so that if I fail to repay the loan, we can deduct automatically from this pool of capital. So this is very interesting, and there's been lots of innovation there. But it's far smaller opportunity than the opportunity to do real world loans and real world lending. So a good example of a RealFi lending might be uncollateralized. We're making a borrower decision based on the identity of the borrower and stuff that we know about them, as opposed to DeFi, which is fully collateralized and no identity information is really required. As we start moving into RealFi, well, now we can start thinking about how we lend to all of these small and medium-sized enterprises across the continent that don't have collateral to put up, but we have various different information sets about them. So that's what RealFi is about. How do we connect up this cryptocurrency liquidity and value and connect that up to these real-world lending opportunities, which are orders of magnitude greater than the DeFi lending possibilities? And this way, we can also, deliver real-world impact from the loans. So that's what RealFi is for us.
So very clear. Are there some projects built on Cardano by independent entrepreneurs that are already taken off and that were able to leverage blockchain technology and the Cardano platform to solve real-life issues in African countries?
Absolutely. So we're starting to see some Cardano projects build in this RealFi space. One project which was probably the first to do so is called Mobile. Mobile provides decentralized internet infrastructure amongst emerging economies. So the first project, which should be live this year, is covering the island of Zanzibar in 4G internet, which is, I think, a third of the price of your typical carriers like MTN or Airtel. In addition to being a lot cheaper, people who are hosting the infrastructure generate a percentage of the profits of the network. So we moved away from a typical model where one company goes and puts up all of these very expensive masts, buys all of this very expensive spectrum, and then expatriates the profits towards one where the users of the network are generating profits for the network, which then goes to repay people who are hosting and have financed that network infrastructure. So it's just a shift away from the single mobile network operator towards a group of decentralized people all helping to provide that internet. So that's a very interesting real world project. Similarly, we've also seen Empower, which is looking to build affordable homes and provide mortgages in Mozambique, also raising from this cryptocurrency liquidity. So these are just a couple. We've got, I think, another 3 or 4 within this RealFi space, all looking to deliver value in Africa. And that's really exciting for us. When you're building a platform, it's not really so much about what you can build, it's what people are going to build on top of you. So we're starting to see the seeds of this. And with the network improvements we have coming imminently, we hope to see an explosion of new projects all seeking to do something similar.
What would be the right approach to adopt for entrepreneurs that would like to develop their solution using Cardano as an infrastructure? The barrier to entry seems quite high, as one needs to learn how the technology works, learn how to code. For instance, the programming language of Cardano is Haskell. So what could be the next step for the inspired listener eager to use the Cardano platform to build solutions?
That's a great question. So, the first thing I'll say is that we have a number of online materials available. So, there is our Plutus Pioneers course, which you can register for, which teaches you how to build smart contracts on Cardano. We have our Prism Pioneers course, which is teaching you how to build on this decentralized identity infrastructure that we've built. And in addition to that, you have a number of incubators and accelerators, which take founders who are looking to build on Cardano in the blockchain space. We even have a number that are focused on Africa. So ICE Addis, the incubator based out of Ethiopia, we're running a program with them, mentoring 30 startups. And the second round, which is open for applications, you can find online if you'd like to register your startup. In Kenya, you have Adanian Labs, which also incubates Cardano blockchain projects. I think also Seed Stars, which is another incubator, is focused on an online incubation course for people who want to build on Cardano. So you've got a number of options. They continue to grow, and you've got a self-serve option where you go and you do these online trainings and you learn to code yourself and you kick it off, versus the slightly more structured incubator accelerator model. So pick whichever one makes most sense for you, and good luck with your journey.
Sounds good. John, what is your vision for Africa? I'm not asking you as the representative of IOHK or Cardano. I'm asking you as John OConnor. How do you believe the future can unfold for Africa in the age of blockchain and other emerging technologies?
Yeah, so for me, Africa holds huge potential, but also has some significant risks. One of the real challenges which any African politician is aware of is the potential youth bulge. So you have some of the fastest growing populations in the world coming out of Africa. And by 2030, we'll really have seen the beginning of that process, culminating in 2050, where Africa by population will be will represent I think it's the majority of the world's population, or at least getting close towards that. So at least this curve, this growth in demographics, is both an opportunity and a risk. The risk being that if you don't fulfill or create enough jobs to be able to match that growth, and then you have challenges. We saw these challenges around the Arab Spring. Large numbers of unemployed young men create large amounts of political instability. So as a result, I feel as a continent, Africa needs to figure out a way to be able to create jobs and livelihoods for this exploding young population. And there's many ways in which this can be done, and some of them can create tremendous opportunities. We've seen, of course, the Chinese model and the Southeast Asian model of being able to industrialize and create this large workforce into a highly productive population that's creating goods. And that model has worked for China, at least. So, I think what we have to do as a continent, or as each country, is figure out what is going to be the USP of this country, and how do we make sure that we lean into the advantages that we have with this growing population, rather than allowing them to become risks. For me, the answer to this question should involve technology in some way. We've seen some fantastic companies like Andela creating amazing software developers. For the audience, Andela is a company where you register, you become a software developer, and you then place for international jobs. So it's an outsourced working model. The point of this model, though, isn't cheapest labor. Andela developers are paid on par with international markets. So this is really a way of harnessing a large amount of young software developers and giving them the opportunity to work with highly skilled jobs at serious wages. So projects like this really interest me because we have to figure out a way of embracing this population. And I hope that it's got to be a better model than just going for the lower cost labor model of super low wages and large factories. So I'm not sure whether it's a clear answer. I'd say it's an aspiration as well as a risk. And I know that if we can sort of pass through this risk and turn it into an opportunity, then Africa will be a force to be reckoned with on the global economy.
John, how can listeners be updated about the news of Cardano in Africa and about the Cardano project and ecosystem in general?
So I'd say that on the Africa side, feel free to follow me on Twitter. My tag is at jjt.o'connor, OCONNOR. That's Juliet Tango then O'Connor. What's it? Oscar, Charlie, Oscar, Niagara, Oscar, Romeo. I think I got that right. So that's one way in which you can follow us. And then, of course, we have lots of IOG communication methods. So you can go on the Cardano Reddit, the subreddit there, where you get a lot of news. At this moment, I think we've got probably 40 or 50 different news distribution outlets. So I'll just go with those two for the moment. Also follow Charles Hoskinson on Twitter as well. He typically posts about a lot of our big announcements.
It's amazing. John, it was an absolute pleasure to have you on Tomorrow.Africa, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the upcoming news of Cardano in Africa.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it, and hopefully you'll see me again in the future.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Feel free to visit our website, Tomorrow.Africa, and subscribe to our channels to be updated about the future episodes. We publish 2 episodes per month at the 1st and 15th of each month, so stay tuned for the next ones. And until then, stay curious, stay ambitious, and see you tomorrow.